Philistines ruled Israel, God's promised land, yet they were slaves in their own homes. They could not plant what they wanted. They could not keep what they grew. Every harvest, the Philistines took the best of their grain and their livestock and left them only enough to scrape by. Across the nation, most had turned away from Jehovah to worship idols. They bowed to stone and wood, hoping to win the favor of their foreign masters. But a handful of faithful families still knelt every night. They closed their doors, pushed aside the fear of punishment, and begged God to send freedom. Year after year, the Philistine yoke grew heavier. Taxes rose, patrols became more brutal. Any man who spoke of rebellion was killed before the sun set. Still, God was quietly working behind the scenes, preparing the help they needed. The faithful did not see it. They did not know how God would answer, but they kept praying. They kept waiting. That preparation began in the small town of Zorah, where a man named Manoah lived with his wife. They came from the tribe of Dan, and their household was one of the few that still kept faith with Jehovah. They knelt every morning and every night. They refused to bow to the Philistine idols set up in the nearby hills. But for all their years of marriage, Manoah's wife had never borne a child. In that time and place, barrenness was a weight she carried every single day. She did not complain. She kept her faith. She just went about her work, one ordinary day after another. One afternoon, she walked out to the wheat fields to check the ripening grain. The sun beat down hot on the back of her neck. She stopped to sit in the shade of an olive tree, alone, and wiped the sweat from her forehead. The air smelled of ripe wheat and dust. The only sound was the buzz of locusts in the branches above. Then, the shadow shifted. It was not the shadow of the tree. She looked up. The angel of the Lord stood before her. She caught her breath. She did not move. The angel spoke. He told her she would soon give birth to a son. He commanded that she must drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. No razor would ever touch the boy's head, for he would be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the moment he was born. And this boy would begin the work of delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines. The angel finished speaking, and she could barely move for the weight of the promise. Her hands shook as she gathered her things. She dropped the tools she had brought to the field, leaving them where they lay, and turned for home as fast as her feet could carry her. The dust kicked up behind her as she ran. Her heart hammered against her ribs the entire way. She burst through the door of their small house and found Manoah sitting by the hearth, and she repeated every word the angel had spoken, exactly as she had heard it. Manoah stood still. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. He trembled, not with joy, but with fear. He knew how great the work God had promised was. He was afraid he would mishear the plan, afraid he would misstep and ruin what God had begun. He would not trust his own understanding. He would not act on second-hand word alone. He needed clear instructions straight from God. Manoah knelt right there on the packed earth floor of his home. He bowed his head. He closed his eyes. He prayed that the angel of the Lord would return to them. He prayed that God would teach them everything they needed to do for this promised child. God never turns away a heart that seeks his will sincerely. God heard Manoah's prayer, and the angel of the Lord came again, exactly as Manoah had asked. The angel found Manoah's wife working in the field again and walked to meet her where she stood. She dropped her work immediately and ran ahead to fetch Manoah, her heart racing with gratitude that God had answered their prayer so quickly. Manoah grabbed a flask of water and a piece of bread from the shelf and hurried after her, his steps slow and careful, full of reverence for the messenger before him. He bowed low when he saw the angel standing in the open between the rows of wheat. He offered the bread and water to the angel, asking him to stay and eat while they spoke. The angel shook his head. He told Manoah he did not need food from human hands. Any offering must be made to Jehovah, not to him. He instructed Manoah to prepare a burnt offering and bring it to the Lord, for this was what God required of them before the child was born. Manoah bowed again, then asked the angel to repeat every word of his command so he would not forget a single detail. The angel did as he asked, speaking slowly and clearly so both Manoah and his wife could hear every word. The child would be born a Nazirite, set apart for God's work from the moment he left the womb. No razor would ever touch his head. His mother would drink no wine or strong drink and eat nothing unclean for the entire time she carried him. This child would be wholly dedicated to God, and he would begin the work that God had ordained he would start to deliver Israel from the Philistine yoke that had crushed the nation for 40 long years. Manoah and his wife listened, and every word settled deep in their hearts. They would not stray from the commands God had given. Months passed. Manoah's wife followed every command God had given. She drank only water, ate only what was clean, and denied herself every food the angel had forbidden. Every night, Manoah knelt beside her and prayed for the child growing inside her, that God would shape him for the work he had called him to do. When the time of labor came, the child was born healthy, whole, and strong. They held him for the first time, their hearts bursting with gratitude for the promise God had kept. They named him Samson, just as the angel had unspokenly directed. They raised him according to the rules God had set. No razor ever touched his head, just as the command required. Samson grew faster than any other boy in the town. He gained height by inches every season. He put on muscle that no amount of training could give an ordinary man. The Lord blessed him every step of the way. The Spirit of the Lord stirred deep in his bones from the time he was a small boy. It did not take long for everyone in Zorah to see that Samson was not like other men. When he was 12, a storm knocked down a massive oak at the edge of the town. 4 grown men tried to drag the trunk out of the road, and they could not move it an inch. Samson walked up, wrapped his hands around the base of the trunk, and dragged it clear by himself. The crowd fell silent. No one had ever seen strength like it. This power did not come from thick muscle alone. It came from the Nazirite vow that bound him to God, and his uncut hair was only the visible symbol of that sacred promise. By the time Samson grew into a young man, his strength was unmatched by any man in the entire land of Israel. Zorah sat right on the border of Philistine territory. As Samson grew into a young man, he began to wander across that border more and more often. He hunted in their hills. He traded at their market stalls. He sat and drank with their young men around campfires at night. He did not see the poison creeping in. The company of idol worshippers slowly softened his heart to the ways of their people. He forgot the commands his parents had taught him from childhood. He stopped seeing the Philistines as enemies who had crushed his people for 40 years. He started seeing them as just neighbors, just friends, just people to please. One day, he traveled down the road into the Philistine city of Timnah. He had walked the road a dozen times before, but this time, something caught his eye. He stopped short, his boots still planted in the dust of the road. There, working in the courtyard of a house near the gate, stood a young Philistine woman. Samson stared. He did not think of the commandments of God. He did not think of his people's bondage. He did not think of the vow that bound him to Jehovah. He only thought that he wanted her. He turned around immediately and started back for Zorah. When he reached his father's house, he found Manoah and his mother and spoke without preamble. He told them he had seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. He told them to get her for him. He said he wanted her to be his wife. Manoah and his wife exchanged a long, heavy look. Their hearts sank. They had raised Samson to fear Jehovah, to walk in his ways, to remember that the Philistines were the oppressors of God's people. They had kept the Nazirite vow for him since before he was born. They had prayed every night that he would grow up to deliver Israel from this very yoke. Now he stood before them, ready to bind himself to the people God had commanded them to reject. Manoah spoke first, his voice steady but thick with worry. He begged Samson to change his mind. He asked if there was no young woman among the daughters of Israel, no girl from a faithful household of the tribe of Dan, that would please him. He reminded Samson that God had forbidden his people to marry those who worshipped idols. He reminded him that this union would pull his heart away from the vow that bound him to God. His mother added her plea. She knelt before him, she took his hand, she begged him to think of what this choice would do to his soul, to his calling, to the work God had prepared for him. She told him that feelings would fade, but a wrong choice would shadow every day of his life. But Samson would not listen. He pulled his hand free from his mother's grip. His jaw set hard. He repeated his demand, louder this time, with no room for argument. He said, "She pleases me. There is no other woman I want. Get her for me." In the end, Manoah and his wife had no choice. They gave in to Samson's demand, and the 3 of them set out for Timnah to finalize the wedding arrangements. The road wound through dry hills, covered in scrub brush and thickets of thorn. Dust coated Samson's boots with every step. The midday sun beat down on his shoulders, and the air hung heavy and still. Samson walked a few steps ahead of his parents, his mind already on the woman waiting in Timnah. He did not watch the brush along the road as closely as he should have. Suddenly, a roar split the silence. The brush exploded outward. A young male lion burst onto the road, claws extended, massive shoulders bunching for the leap. It charged straight for Samson, fangs bared, hot breath, already reeking of blood. Samson had no time to draw a blade. He had no time to dodge out of the way. The lion was already on him. In that instant, the Spirit of the Lord fell over Samson with overwhelming power. Every muscle in his body ignited. He did not flinch. He reached out both hands, caught the lion by the upper jaw, and wrenched with all his might. The bones in the lion's neck snapped with a sharp, wet crack. The beast went limp in his grip before it could even bite down. Samson let the carcass fall to the side of the road. He wiped the dust and blood from his palms on the grass. He adjusted his tunic and kept walking down the road toward Timnah. He never mentioned the attack to his parents. He never told anyone what he had done that day. Weeks passed. The wedding day arrived, and Samson set out again for Timnah to join the feast. The summer heat had baked the hills dry in the time he had been gone. The grass along the roadside was brown and brittle, crumpling under his boots with every step. As he passed the spot where he had left the lion's carcass, he slowed his pace. Curiosity pulled him off the road to look at what remained. He pushed through the low brush and stopped short. The air hummed with a low, steady buzz. A whole swarm of wild bees had moved into the empty ribcage of the lion and built their hive right inside the bones. The crevices oozed with golden honey, thick and sweet. No predator had found the carcass in the weeks since the attack. No scavenger had dragged the bones away. God had left it exactly where it lay, waiting for Samson. Samson reached into the hive, cupped his hands, and scooped out a chunk of the honeycomb. The honey dripped between his fingers, sticky and warm from the sun. He licked it from his palms. It tasted sweeter than any honey he had ever eaten. He broke off more pieces, filled his hands, and wrapped them in a scrap of cloth to carry with him. When he caught up to his parents on the road, he pulled out the honey and gave some to them. They ate it and praised the sweetness, but they never asked where he had gotten it, and Samson never told them. Samson arrived in Timnah as the sun dipped below the hills. The wedding feast had been laid out in the open courtyard of his bride's father's house. Tables groaned under roasted meat and flat bread, and wine flowed freely in clay cups all around. 30 Philistine groomsmen sat at the table with Samson, laughing and shouting, their voices loud and rough over the crackle of the cook fires. Samson sat silent at the head of the table, watching them. He knew none of these men would ever guess the secret he carried from the road. He leaned forward, tapped his cup against the table to get their attention, and offered them a challenge. He told them he would speak a riddle. If any man could solve it within the 7 days of the feast, he would give that man 30 fine linen garments and 30 changes of clothing, a prize worth more than most Philistine farmers earned in a year. If none of them found the answer, they would owe him the same reward. The groomsmen fell silent. They leaned in, curious and greedy. None of them suspecting the riddle came from an encounter only Samson knew. They agreed to the terms quickly. Certain one of them would untangle the verse before the 7th day ended. Samson smiled, let the silence stretch for a beat, then spoke the riddle slowly, so every man heard it clearly. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The groomsmen repeated the words to each other, muttering under their breath. They tossed out guess after guess, but none of them fit. By the end of the first night, they had no answer. The game had only just begun. 3 full days passed. The feast went on, but the Philistines stopped laughing. They huddled in small groups away from Samson, scribbling notes in sand and tossing out new guesses every hour. None of them fit. The riddle twisted through their brains, but no answer clicked. They started to sweat. The prize was no joke. 30 fine linen garments and 30 changes of clothing would cost every groomsman more than he owned. If they lost, they would have to sell their lands, their tools, even their own families to pay the debt. Ruin stared every man in the face. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the groomsmen spoke up. He pointed out the one person in the whole city who could get the answer for them. She was Samson's bride, a Philistine woman born and raised in Timnah. She has Samson's ear. Samson trusted her. If anyone could get the secret, it was her. The men walked straight to her father's house, found her alone, and surrounded her. Their voices were low, sharp, and full of unmasked threat. They told her, "Coax the answer out of Samson before the 7th day ends. If you fail, we will burn you and your entire father's house to the ground. Not a single soul will leave alive." The woman's blood turned to ice in her veins. She had no way to fight back. She agreed to their terms. That same evening, when Samson came to her after the feast, she met him with tears already in her eyes. She clung to Samson's arm and pressed her face against his chest, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. She begged him over and over to tell her the answer to the riddle. She said she would not rest, she would not eat, until he trusted her with the secret. Samson pulled her close, laughed, and told her the riddle was just a game for the groomsmen. There was no need to trouble herself over it. That answer only made her cry harder. The next morning, she met him at breakfast with red, puffy eyes and started begging again. By midday, she had followed him every step he took, her voice soft but unrelenting, never letting the demand fade. The feast stretched on, and so did her weeping. She cried at the table when the groomsmen sat around them. She cried when they were alone in the dark of their chamber. She did not stop, not for a single day. Samson began to snap at her, to snap at anyone who came near. The constant noise of her weeping wore at his nerves like water wears at stone. Every day it cut a little deeper, wore away a little more of his resolve. By the morning of the 7th day, Samson had nothing left to give. He could not think, he could not eat, he could not sleep for the sound of her crying. He gave in. He told her the whole story. The second the words left his mouth, her crying stopped. She wiped the tears from her cheeks, pulled away from his side, and told him she needed to step outside for a breath of air. She ran straight through the courtyard, out the gate, and straight to the waiting Philistine groomsmen. Before the sun dipped below the Timnah city walls, the Philistine groomsmen found Samson in the feast hall. They stood in a line across the doorway, grinning wide with malicious triumph, and spoke the answer in unison. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson's jaw locked. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The betrayal burned through his veins like fire. He looked from their grinning faces to the empty spot where his bride had been sitting 10 minutes before, and he knew exactly what had happened. He spat his answer through gritted teeth. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would never have solved my riddle." The Spirit of the Lord rushed over him then, filling his muscles with a power that hummed under his skin. He did not stop to argue. He did not stop to confront the bride or her father. He turned on his heel, walked out of the feast hall, and did not slow his pace until he reached the city gates. He knew the bet. He would pay what he owed, but he would take the payment from the Philistines themselves. He walked north along the coastal road, all the way to the Philistine city of Ashkelon. The sun set behind him and the moon rose, but he did not stop to rest. When he reached the city's outer market, he found 30 Philistine men drinking and trading by torchlight. He attacked without warning. None of them had time to draw a blade before he had cut every man down. He stripped every body of their clothing, bundled the garments together over his shoulder, and walked straight back to Timnah. Samson slammed the gate of Timnah behind him and did not look back. For months, the rage simmered in his bones. He worked his father's fields, he hunted in the hills, and every thought of Philistine treachery made his hands clench. But even the hottest fire cools with time. The sharp edges of his anger wore down. He told himself the bride had been threatened, that she had acted out of fear, that the groomsmen were the real villains. He began to think of her face, of the way she had smiled at him during the first days of the feast, and he decided to go back. He would make peace. He would bring a gift, and everything would be put right. He tracked a young goat through the brush on the edge of the hills, drove his knife into its throat, and tied it to a pole across his shoulders. It was a proper gift for a father, a sign that he came in good faith. He walked the familiar road to Timnah, the sun warm on his back, his mind already turning to how he would greet his bride. When he reached the door of her father's house, he knocked once, then again. The door cracked open, but only a hand's width. Her father stood in the gap, his body pressed tight against the frame, and refused to let him cross the threshold. Samson turned away from the closed door, and every last trace of warmth left his body. He did not shout. He did not bang on the wood. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of Timnah, back toward the hills, and every step carried the weight of his oath. He said, aloud, to the empty wind around him, "This time, I have every right to hurt the Philistines. No one can blame me for what I do next." He dropped the goat carcass by the side of the road. He did not need a gift anymore. He climbed higher into the hills, where foxes denned in the rock crevices and hunted at dusk. He set traps along the game trails, dug out dens one by one, and by the end of 3 days, he had 300 live foxes, trapped and bound. He sorted them into pairs, tied their tails together with thin, strong strips of leather he had cut from a dead Philistine's belt. He cut a bundle of dry olive branches, dipped each in pitch to make a torch, and wedged one torch between every tied pair of tails. He tested the first knot, pulled hard to make sure it would hold as the foxes ran, and adjusted the torch so it sat tight, close enough to the tied tails that the fox could not shake it loose. He lit every torch one by one, holding them until the pitch caught and the flame burned bright. Then he turned each pair loose, one after another, and sent them running straight down the hills into the Philistines' standing grain fields. The grain had been parched by 3 months of summer sun. It burned like dry tinder the second the flame touched it. The foxes ran in every direction, panic driving them through the rows, spreading the fire faster than any man could run. Within an hour, every standing grain field across the entire lowland was burning. The flames jumped from field to field, caught the dry underbrush of the vineyards, then spread to the olive groves. Nothing could stop it. By dawn, every crop the Philistines had planted that year lay in black ash, and the wind carried the smoke all the way to the coast. Smoke still hung over the lowlands when the Philistine rulers gathered in Timnah to plan their revenge. They sent scouts out at first light, and the scouts came back with one clear answer. The fire was Samson's work. The rulers sat on their carved stone seats, spat into the dust, and debated their next move. Samson was hidden in the hills, hard to catch. But Samson had ties here, in Timnah. His bride was from this city. Her father had hosted the wedding that started all the trouble. This attack was Samson's revenge for her being given to another man. If they punished the woman and her house, they would send Samson a message. They would force him to come down out of the hills to face them. The ruling was passed before midday. Before the sun reached its highest point, a detachment of Philistine soldiers marched to the house of Samson's bride. They surrounded the walls, blocked every exit, and piled dry brush against the wooden gates. They set the brush alight. The fire caught the wood, climbed the walls, and swallowed the entire house. Samson's bride, her father, every member of the household died in the flames. Nothing was left but blackened stone and ash. Word of the burning traveled fast. It reached Samson in the hills before the sun set. When he heard what had been done, he did not roar. He did not shake his fists at the sky. He simply knelt, drove his knife into the rock at his feet, and swore a harsh oath. He said, "I will not stop until I have had my revenge. Every Philistine that crosses my path will pay for this." Samson struck without warning, cutting through the scattered Philistine patrols that had been sent to hunt him. He moved fast, struck hard, and by the time the Philistine main force regrouped, dozens of their men lay dead on the rocky slopes. Samson knew he was outnumbered. He did not stay to fight a larger battle. He retreated deeper into the rocky hills, found a narrow cave hidden behind a curtain of ivy in the rock of Etam, and pulled a pile of loose stones across the mouth to hide the entrance. He settled in to wait. The Philistine high command did not bother searching the hills themselves. They had a simpler, crueler plan. They marched their entire army straight into the territory of Judah, set up camp along the border, and sent messengers to every village and town. The message was clear: hand over the man who burned our crops and killed our people, or we will burn every village in Judah to the ground. 40 years of oppression had broken the spirit of the people of Judah. 3,000 men reached the mouth of the cave by midday. They called out to Samson through the crack between the stones. They told him why they had come. Samson heard their plea. He did not fight his own people. He told them he would let them bind him and hand him over, on the promise they would not kill him themselves. They agreed. They dragged the loose stones away from the cave mouth and brought out 2 new thick hemp ropes that had never been used before. They wrapped them tight around his wrists, around his upper arms, pulled the knots so hard the rope bit into his skin. Samson did not resist. He let them lead him down the hill, toward the waiting Philistine army. The Philistine sentries spotted the procession first. They shouted the news back through the ranks. The entire army roared. They cheered and stamped their feet, certain they had caught the man who had killed so many of their brothers. They held back their spearmen, letting the men of Judah lead Samson straight into the open space between the two armies. No one expected what came next. The moment the ropes went slack for the Philistines to seize him, the Spirit of the Lord crashed over Samson like a river of fire. He tensed his arms. The ropes burned like dry flax against his skin. They split. They fell free to the ground before anyone could move to grab him. A fresh donkey's jawbone lay half buried in the dust at his feet. He bent down, snatched it up in one calloused hand, and charged straight into the thickest crowd of Philistine soldiers. He struck left. He struck right. The jawbone crushed bone and split flesh. Every blow brought down another man. Samson stood panting, the jawbone still in his hand, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. The heat of the midday sun beat down on his bare back. Dust caked his throat and clung to the sweat on his skin. He had fought for an hour without rest, and every muscle in his body screamed for water. He scanned the open ground around him. No stream ran through the rocky valley. No shaded spring broke the dry, sun-baked earth. The only liquid he could see soaked into the dust at his feet. His throat swelled shut. He could barely swallow. He knew what only strength could not do. He lifted his face toward heaven and cried out to God. He said, "You have given this great victory through my hand. Must I now die of thirst here and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" The words had barely left his mouth when God split open a hollow pocket in the rock right at his feet. Cool, clear, fresh water poured out from the split stone, pooling in the hollow at Samson's feet. Samson dropped the jawbone into the dust. He knelt down, cupped the water in his hands, and drank deeply. The cool liquid slid down his parched throat, filling his empty veins and clearing the fog from his head. Strength rushed back into his limbs. The color returned to his face. He stood up, his balance steady, his gaze sharp. When the surviving men of Judah saw what had happened, when they saw 1,000 Philistines dead at the feet of one man, and God himself providing water to keep him alive, they knew who their leader should be. They gathered around him, swore their allegiance, and asked him to judge them and lead them against the Philistines. Samson accepted the call. He ruled as judge over Israel for 20 years, and throughout those 2 decades, the Philistines dared not move against Israel's borders. 20 years of unchallenged power changed Samson. He grew proud. He trusted in the strength of his own arms, instead of clinging to the God who had given that strength to him. He forgot the lessons of his early mistakes, and he stopped guarding his heart against the temptations that had always pulled him away. One day, he traveled beyond the borders of Israel, into the valley of Sorek land held firmly by the Philistines. The valley was famous for its lush, rolling vineyards, heavy with ripe purple grapes. It was a special trap for Samson. He had already broken his Nazirite vow once, slipping and drinking wine when he should have abstained. He had already cut one more tie that bound him to God and purity. In that valley, he met Delilah. He looked at her, and his passion overruled every warning he had ever heard. He fell in love with her, and he kept going back to her, ignoring every voice that told him to turn away. Word of Samson's attachment to Delilah reached the rulers of the Philistines. They saw their chance. They traveled to Sorek themselves, found Delilah alone, and laid out their offer. Each ruler promised her 1,100 shekels of silver, more wealth than she had ever dreamed of, if she would trick Samson into revealing the secret of his great strength. Delilah did not hesitate. She agreed to the deal. She would help them capture the man who said he loved her. The next time Samson came to her house, Delilah sat beside him and pressed him with soft, urgent pleas. She said, "Tell me the secret of your great strength. Tell me how anyone can bind you and make you weak. I need to know." Samson did not trust her. He had lied to her before the deal was even struck, and he lied again now. He said, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh, green bowstrings that have never been dried, I will become as weak as any other man." Delilah sent word to the Philistine rulers, and they brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that same hour. She hid armed men in the inner room of the house then called out to Samson where he lay resting. She said, "Wake up, the Philistines are upon you." Samson jumped to his feet. He snapped the bowstrings as easily as a man snaps a piece of dry flax tossed into a fire. No force held him. Delilah cried out in false rage and hurt. She said, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Now tell me the truth. How can you be tied?" Samson lied a second time. He told her to use new, untried ropes that had never been put to work. She tried that. He broke the ropes as if they were frayed thread. He walked free again. A third time, he told her to weave his 7 braids of hair into the web of her loom and pin them tight to the frame. When she called out that the Philistines were coming, he tore the whole loom right out of the ground and got free. Delilah pressed him harder. She said, "How can you say you love me when you will not trust me with your secret? You have made a fool of me 3 times now." 3 times Samson had clear proof that Delilah meant to betray him. 3 times he could have walked away and saved himself, but he pushed every warning aside. He kept coming back. Day after day, she nagged and pressed him. She wore down his resistance until his soul was vexed to the point of death. Finally, he broke. Samson sat across from Delilah, his shoulders slack, his will drained to nothing. He had pushed aside every warning. He had ignored every sign of her treachery. Now there was nothing left to hold back. He leaned forward, his voice rough with the weight of what he was about to give away. He said, "No razor has ever touched my head. I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the moment I formed in my mother's womb. This vow has bound me from before I took my first breath. My strength is not my own. It is the gift God gave me because I kept my promise to him. If my head is shaved, the vow is broken. My strength will leave me, and I will become as weak as any other man." He stopped. He had given away everything. He had laid the secret of his power and his soul at the feet of the woman who had been paid to destroy him. 3 times he had lied to protect himself. 3 times he had seen her try to hand him over to his enemies. He had survived every attempt, but he chose to surrender anyway. He chose to satisfy her nagging, to end the constant pressure, instead of walking away from the temptation that had already pulled him so far from God. Delilah stared at him. She knew at once. He had finally told her the truth. No more lies, no more tricks. The secret that the Philistines had waited so long to learn was now hers. Delilah did not waste a single moment. She sent word at once to the Philistine rulers, who sent the man she needed to do the deed. She arranged everything while Samson sat beside her, still raw from surrendering his secret. She coaxed him to rest. She murmured soft words to him, telling him he was safe with her, that she only wanted him to be comfortable after days of stress. She guided his head down to rest in her lap. His eyelids were heavy. He had spent every ounce of his will resisting her nagging, and now that he had given in, every part of him relaxed. He did not see the man slip into the room, silent as a shadow. He did not feel the blade lifted toward his head. He did not hear the quiet breathing of the armed men waiting just beyond the door. He drifted off to sleep, completely unguarded, completely at her mercy. The man stepped forward. He leaned close. The cold blade brushed the first braid. One by one, the thick braids that had never been touched by steel fell to the floor. Each cut bit deeper into the vow Samson had kept for his entire life. The last braid slid free of the blade and hit the floor. In that same instant, the power that had rested in Samson's bones for 30 years drained away. The gift of God left him before he ever opened his eyes. Delilah did not wait for Samson to wake to spring her trap. She pushed his head gently away from her lap, stood and called out loud enough for every hidden man to hear. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." The shout cut through Samson's sleep like a knife. He jolted upright, his hands already clenching to fight, his body primed to snap any bonds and scatter his attackers just as he had done 3 times before in this very house. He pushed to his feet, ready to tear the room apart and run. He did not feel the familiar surge of power. He did not feel the Spirit of the Lord fill his muscles and harden his grip. His limbs were light, weak, like any ordinary man's. He had survived a dozen ambushes. He had broken every rope and every bowstring. But this time, it was different. This time, he had broken the vow that held the power. God had left him, and he did not even know it until that moment. The Philistines poured into the room before he could react. They seized him easily, no struggle, no fight. They dragged him out of the house, bound his hands and feet with heavy bronze shackles that bit into his flesh. They held him down, and one of their men drove a hot iron into first one eye, then the other. The pain exploded through his skull, and darkness swallowed his world forever. When the screaming stopped, they dragged him down the road to Gaza, the very heart of Philistine power. They threw him into the stone prison, stripped of everything, and set him to work grinding grain with a heavy stone handmill. The job that belonged to donkeys, to the lowest of slaves, was now his. Day after day, Samson leaned his weight into the heavy millstone. It turned around and around, grinding grain into flour, every rotation a reminder of the choice he had made. He could not see the stone. He could not see the walls of his cell. He could only feel the rough wood of the handle under his hands, the burn in his shoulders, the ache in his empty eye sockets. Pride had brought him here. Uncontrolled passion had cut away his vow, his sight, his strength. In the endless dark, there was no distraction left. No beautiful woman to lure him, no Philistine to fight, no crowd to cheer his victories, only his own sin and the God he had abandoned. Slowly, the hard heart he had carried since youth began to break. He repented. He turned back to the Lord he had ignored for so long. He remembered the vow he had broken, and he begged God for forgiveness. As the months dragged on, the hair that had been shaved clean began to grow again. Inch by inch, the strength God had given him slowly returned. The Philistines never checked. They never thought to look. They saw only a blind, broken slave who could not fight back, who could not hurt them anymore. After months of preparation, the Philistines gathered for their greatest feast of the year. They had come together from every corner of their land to honor Dagon, their national god. They filled every corner of his great stone temple. 3,000 nobles and commoners crowded onto the flat roof above the main hall, drinking and feasting and celebrating. They had their greatest enemy locked in a cell. Dagon had won. In the middle of the revelry, someone called out for sport. "Bring out Samson. Let the blind giant entertain us. Let us mock the man who once terrified our people." The guards unlocked Samson's cell. They led him out into the bright, hot feast hall, into the roar of the crowd that hated him. The roar of the crowd hit Samson like a physical blow. Every laugh, every shout, every jeer echoed off the stone walls, bouncing back to bite at his skin. They prodded him, made him stumble through silly tricks for their amusement, cheered louder with every awkward misstep he took. Samson did not fight. He did not rage. He let the noise wash over him. His empty eye sockets turned toward the sound of the crowd, his mind fixed on one thing only. He leaned his weight against the boy who held his hand, the one who had led him out of the prison, and spoke in a low, steady voice that only the boy could hear. "Lead me to the main pillars that hold this temple up. I am tired. I want to lean against them and rest." The boy did not suspect. He led Samson forward, step by step, through the crowd that parted to let him pass, laughing as the blind giant stumbled. No one stopped him. No one saw the purpose in his slow, deliberate steps. They thought he was just a broken old slave, begging for a moment to rest before they sent him back to his cell. He felt the rough, cold stone of the two central pillars press against his palms. These were the pillars that held the entire temple up. Every stone, every beam, every roof that held the 3,000 Philistine men and women above depended on these two blocks of rock. He stepped between them, bracing his shoulders against the solid stone, and lifted his blind face up toward the sky. He could not see heaven, but he knew God was there. He had turned back, and he did not ask for deliverance for himself. He only asked for one last chance to do the work God had called him to do, one last blow against the enemies of his people. His voice was rough, cracked from months of hard labor, but it was clear and steady when he prayed. "Sovereign Lord, remember me now. Strengthen me just once more, O God. Let me get revenge on the Philistines for taking my two eyes with one final blow." He planted his feet wide on the stone floor of the temple. He wrapped his right hand around the right pillar, his left hand around the left pillar. He tightened every muscle in his body, feeling the strength God had given him flood back into his bones. He pushed. The stone groaned under his weight. The mortar between the blocks cracked and showered down in fine dust. Samson pushed harder, his muscles screaming with the effort, his voice ringing through the feast hall. "Let me die with the Philistines." A deep rumble rolled up from the foundation of the temple. It shook the floor under every foot. The laughter on the roof cut off mid-shout. People grabbed for the nearest wall, for each other, as the rumble grew louder. The two central pillars split down the middle. They shifted outward, their bases tearing free from the stone foundation. The entire upper structure lurched. Beams splintered. Stones rained down into the feast hall. The flat roof holding 3,000 Philistines collapsed inward, crashing down onto the crowd below. Dust and smoke boiled up into the sky, blocking out the sun. When the dust finally cleared, there was no temple left, only a pile of broken stone and broken bodies. Every Philistine in the temple was dead. Samson lay under the rubble, right beside the enemies he had come to destroy. When the survivors counted the dead, they made a terrible discovery. Samson had killed more Philistines in that single final blow than he had killed in all the 20 years of his life of fighting. God's promise, made 40 years before to a handful of faithful people begging for deliverance, was finally fulfilled. The yoke of the Philistines had been broken just as God had planned. It was broken by the very man God had prepared for the work before he had even been born. Samson's family traveled from Zorah to Gaza to retrieve his body. They carried him home and laid him to rest in the tomb of his father Manoah, between Zorah and Eshtal. He had led Israel as their judge for 20 years, just as the story records. God's promise to deliver Israel through Samson was finally, completely fulfilled. But what a dark, tragic record his life left behind. It could have been a life that brought great praise to God and glory to the entire nation of Israel. Physically, Samson was the strongest man on earth. No ordinary rope could hold him. No lion could outmatch him. No army could stand against him when the Spirit of God moved through him. But when it came to self-control, integrity, and standing firm for God, he was one of the weakest men who ever lived. Many people today mistake strong passions for strong character. But a man who is mastered by his own passions is always a weak man. The real greatness of a person is measured by the feelings they control, not by the feelings that control them. Satan always attacks us at our weakest points, but no one has to fall to his attacks. God gives help to every soul that truly wants to overcome temptation. This is the most important lesson Samson's life leaves for us. God can use even deeply flawed people to accomplish his good purposes. Samson's extraordinary strength was matched only by his human weakness. Yet in the end, he fulfilled the divine mission God had given him before he was even born. Through his life, we learn the importance of keeping faith, the deadly danger of giving in to temptation, and the sovereign power of God's will that can even work through our mistakes to bring about his plan.